Hello class. This is going to be our first video, our first lecture for the abnormal psychology class, which of course is not meeting in person. So this will be the main way that I'm giving information, giving lectures to you throughout the course of this semester for this class. Of course, you will also have your book to follow along with. And then I also recommend, if you haven't gotten one already, I think it's listed in your syllabus as a recommended. It's not listed as the required text. But I often will be referencing the DSM throughout this course, and so that's probably just going to be really helpful for you to be able to follow along. Sometimes if I'm quoting something, I'm even going to quote something today out of the DSM. I think that quote is also in the textbook, probably in the first chapter, if not the first two chapters. But I don't have that page number for you, so you might be able to find it without the DSM. But often if I'm going to point you to something specific, I'm usually going to point to the DSM in this class, because really that's where I'm going to be drawing most of our information in terms of what types of disorders we're going to be talking about, what the diagnostic criteria, what they look like on a person from a day-to-day perspective, or even from a clinician's perspective. Usually I'm going to point to the DSM and then go from there. So that might be something that's really helpful for you to have. I would say if you're in this class because you're planning to go into clinical psychology, or you're planning to go into social work, or into counseling, or to go into graduate school to be some type of applied psychologist, I would say it makes sense to go ahead and just have a DSM anyway. This is something that you're going to be referencing throughout your academic, but also if your plans work out, right, through also your professional career. And this isn't a document, the DSM, this isn't something that they necessarily change super often. I think maybe once every 10, maybe every 20 years they change it, and this one came out about 5 years ago. So there's probably at the very least another 5 years on this DSM before you'd ever have to buy another one, if they don't just do some small changes, which they sometimes do as well. So those are the two books that are mostly going to be important. Occasionally, very occasionally in this particular class, I will point you to perhaps an article or something that I want you to take a look at. Generally, that'll be something that I just post on Blackboard, or something that I would present to you in a lecture format. So I am going to still try to do some PowerPoints or some slideshow presentations. I don't do much PowerPoints, but occasionally I would like to put some stuff up on here. So I'm going to try that out and see how that works. I honestly don't want to have to spend the time to go back through all of these videos and edit in the text that I should just lay over the video. That's just going to take a lot more time in addition to what's going on. So I'm going to try to make this work and really just kind of teach it how I would teach it if you were here in the classroom, putting up slides, writing on the board. I can't take your questions, but you can send me emails for those types of things. And we're going to see how it works. If it becomes a thing where you say, hey, we absolutely can't see what you're writing on the board there, then I'll figure something out that'll work. Maybe just move the camera closer, or maybe, like I said, just overlay the text. I did that for some classes last year when we cut out because they couldn't see what I was writing. Okay, so let's go ahead and just get started. And the first thing that I like to talk about in this class is just this definition of abnormal psychology. So you can see on your syllabus, and again, your syllabus is on Blackboard. I'm not sure how you would have found this if you hadn't found the syllabus yet, but the syllabus is on Blackboard, and you can see that these first couple lectures, these first couple classes, we're really going to just try to be figuring out what it is that we're talking about, right? What is it that we mean when we say abnormal psychology, or mental disorder, or psychological distress? What do all of these things mean, and how can we come to understand them in such a way that we can begin to talk about abnormal psychologies and begin diagnosing folks in a way that other clinicians, other professionals are going to respect and recognize, right? We first have to come to some understanding of what it is that abnormal psychology means. Now, if you think about that term, abnormal psychology, it's really fraught with some pitfalls, some potential to think that it means some things that it doesn't necessarily mean, right? Often this is the point where if you were sitting here in front of me, I would say, well, what do we mean by abnormal psychology? And one of the first things that students often say is it means it's just out of the ordinary. Abnormal just means it's a minority, it's unique, it's not something that's common, it's just a type of psychology that isn't necessarily something that we would expect to see around a lot. Okay, sure, abnormal psychology may well include those things that are just what I would hear you saying is rare, right? These things are just rare. That might mean abnormal psychology. And to that I would argue, well, what about somebody who's got a really high intelligence? What about somebody who's got 160 intelligence? That's on the 99th percentile, I think, at least the 98th percentile. That's extremely rare. When I say abnormal psychology, when I say mental health concern, which is maybe what we mean when we say abnormal psychology, if I say that, is that what springs to mind? Is somebody who's just really, really, really smart the type of person that springs to mind? Or somebody who's got perfect pitch, right? Somebody who can hear a tone and be able to recognize that just mentally, right? They don't need to look it up, they don't need to use a tuning fork or whatever, right? They can just hear that thing and be able to perceive, right? That is psychology. They are able to perceive what that pitch is. Is that what we mean when we say abnormal psychology, or is that what we mean when we say mental health issue? Probably not. Probably what we're thinking about when we say abnormal psychology really has more to do with somebody who's got some type of distress, right? Who's got some type of problem. That is to say, it's a problem for them, it's a problem for them moving forward in the world, it's a problem for them forming relationships, or it's a problem not necessarily for them or as they see it, but it is a problem for the course of their life, right? I don't see myself as having a problem with X, Y, or Z, but I don't seem to be able to get a job. I don't seem to be able to work things out with my children. I don't seem to be able to X, Y, and Z, right? And so what we're really probably talking about when we have this idea of abnormal psychology really has to do with, is it causing problems in your life? And that's the most important thing, and that's the place that I'm going to keep coming back to throughout this course, and you'll hear me say it like this: is it causing harm? Is it causing some sort of problem? Is it causing some sort of distress? Now again, that distress may be just for the individual, right? I'm depressed, I'm sad, I don't like the way that feels, I'm anxious, I don't like how nervous and panicky I get in certain situations, right? That might be that internal distress, but again, it may also be a distress for other people, right? I'm a narcissist and I think I'm awesome and you guys just got in my way, so I'm sorry that you're not as good as me, right? I may feel like that's fine, I'm good, but other people may have a hard time dealing with me. Other people may have a hard time hiring me. I may have some other problems in my life due to this way that I perceive myself or feel about other people, even though it's not directly distressing to me. Really, it's about how this is affecting others that becomes a problem for my life as I'm trying to move through it. So let's take a look at this actual definition of mental disorder. And one of the things that you're going to notice, I'll go ahead and pull it up. One of the things that you're going to notice about this is that it's really long. This is a really long definition for something that I imagine if you just ask the casual person on the street, they'd give you a 1 or 2 word response for, or maybe just a sentence, but certainly not a paragraph. And that's because I think, unfortunately, probably, we think about mental disorders in the same way that we think about diseases or physical disorders. without really thinking about it. I think once it's explained, right, this difference makes sense. But I think when we first think about it, right, we think about it in this very black or white way. Do you have depression? Do you have anxiety? Do you have some mental health concern? When in fact, there's a really, really big difference. When I'm talking about most, not all, but when I'm talking about most diseases of the body, well, I can test for that, right? If you've got the flu, or I'm curious if you've got the flu, or hell, COVID, right? I can go to the doctor, I can send you to the doctor, and I can see if you've got that pathogen in your body, right? I can just see if it's present, or I can see if it's present in a large enough amount, right? Sometimes you have the pathogen in the body, but your body kills it off before it really takes hold of you, so it doesn't really get that serious. But either way, I can just look in your body and see, okay, well, do you have COVID or don't you, right? You either have zero, you have minimal that's not going to show up, or you've got it. We can't do that with mental disorders, right? There's no blood tests, there's no cotton swab I can stick in your nose to see if you've got depression. There's no way for me to just go, oh, this person's depressed or not. Really, it's a conglomeration of a lot of different things, and we'll talk about this going forward, right? This idea of really mental disorders are sort of a constellation of symptoms, perhaps caused or brought about by something else, but in terms of how we recognize them, we just will say, well, you've got this and this and this and this and this, and usually when those things go together, that kind of means you might be depressed or general anxiety disorder, or you've got a phobia of, I don't know, snakes or something. And so here's this definition. Here is how we can begin to break down what a mental disorder is, given that it really is sort of squishy. It really isn't something that is exact in the way that we think about, again, a physical disorder or some disease. So I'm going to read this all once, and then we'll go back through and break down exactly what it is that these things are meaning. So a mental disorder is a syndrome characterized by clinically significant disturbances in an individual's cognition, emotion regulation, or behavior that reflects a dysfunction in the psychological, biological, or developmental processes underlying mental function. Mental disorders are usually associated with significant distress or disability in social, occupational, or other important activities. An expectable or culturally approved response to a common stressor or loss, such as the death of a loved one, is not a mental disorder. Socially deviant behaviors, such as political, religious, or sexual, in conflicts that are primarily between the individual and society, are not mental disorders, unless the deviance or conflict results from dysfunction in the individual as described above. So that's a lot, right? That's a lot. But what does it mean? Let's break this down, and so let's read through it again and look at what each of these pieces might mean. So a mental disorder is what we're talking about, right? What is a mental disorder? A mental disorder is a syndrome characterized by clinically significant disturbances. So really this just means significant changes, clinically significant changes. Disturbance just means change here. It's disturbed from where it was before it was disturbed, is what we mean. So clinically significant disturbances in an individual's cognition, emotion regulation, or behavior. So we've got cognition, emotion regulation, and behavior. These three terms are pretty important for us going forward. I would add one other in terms of unconscious, but we'll get into that when we get into it. But cognition, emotion regulation, and behavior, or even just emotion, are really thought of as sort of the triad of psychology. Kind of what else is there? Again, I would add the unconscious, but generally speaking, in terms of what's available to us, in terms of how we recognize one another, in terms of personality, in terms of who this person is, et cetera, what types of things that they do. Really, these are the things that we're talking about, even in terms of recognizing ourselves, right? How do you think about things? This is what cognition means, is your thought process. Of course, here we don't just mean thinking in terms of the words in your head, right? The things that you're telling yourself. We do mean that, but we also mean the thought processes that you have. How did you come to that conclusion? How did you see it that way when I saw it this way, et cetera, et cetera. So cognition is just thinking, and then of course emotion is those emotive parts of ourselves, right? Different feelings, sad, happy, we know what feelings are. And then your behaviors, right? The types of things that you do, from the ways that you move to the reflexes that you have to the long-term actions that you take in a day or in a lifetime. So these are the three things that are most important to us as psychologists, whether applied or research psychologists. This is generally one of these things in some fashion is what we're looking at. So a mental disorder is a syndrome characterized by disturbances in one of these things. So why would you go see a psychologist, or what would we consider a mental disorder? Well, we would consider a mental disorder something that's disturbing, either the way that you think, the way that you feel, or your ability to regulate that at least, and or your behaviors. So a mental disorder is going to be something that disturbs one of these things. I want to come back to this idea of emotion regulation. Why is it emotion regulation here and not just emotion? Again, if we're thinking about that sort of triad of psychology, we would really just say emotion, yet in this description of a mental disorder, we have emotion regulation. They didn't just go with emotion. That's pretty important, and I really appreciate the writers of this for making that catch, because what we want to emphasize here is that emotions are not problematic, or things that change your emotion are not problematic, right? You see a dog get hit in the street, you see a dog get hit in the street and you get sad. There's not a problem with that. There's no problem in the fact that that made you upset. In fact, if you didn't get upset, that might suggest more of a problem. Now, not to say that everybody cares about dogs, but let's say that one of your parents died, right? The fact that you got upset about that is not a problem, right? That is a normal and expectable emotional reaction, and you'll see this up here in a second. But what might be a problem is if you couldn't go to work because you were crying so much, or you were so angry at the way it happened that you couldn't stand to be around, I don't know, whatever type of car it was that the person got in an accident with, right? You couldn't just be on the street with them. If you saw one of those cars on the street, you have a panic attack and you have to pull over and you can't get to work, or you can't pick your kids up that day, right? And so what this definition here is trying to emphasize is that it's not the emotion, right? You should be sad in many cases. You should be happy, angry, all these things. These are human emotions. And it's being very careful here at the outset to say it's not the emotion that's problematic, it's the ability to regulate the emotion, right? It's the ability to be sad and still get up and go to work the next day, or be angry and still be able to be in the same room with that person without attacking them, right? These are the types of things that would be problematic if you couldn't do them, if you couldn't regulate your emotions in a suitable fashion. Now, not to say that there's a problem with this person in terms of them being a bad person, but we are talking about, of course, a mental disorder. So something is wrong. Something is wrong if you can't regulate those emotions to that degree. And here is what we're talking about. So, a mental disorder is a syndrome characterized by clinically significant disturbances in one of these three things that reflects a dysfunction in the person's psychological, biological, or developmental processes underlying mental functioning. So why is it that if it's cognition, emotion regulation, in behavior, if these are the things that are in the purview of a psychologist, or these are the things that reflect a mental disorder, why are we now talking about biological and developmental processes in addition to those psychological processes? Is it these or is it those? Well, it's potentially both, right? This line here is saying that biological and developmental processes and psychological ones may underlie mental functioning. So let's say that you have a biological, addiction to smoking cigarettes or to heroin. I don't know what you do. Let's say that you've got a biological addiction to that. Well, that is coming from a biological place, but now it's affecting your behavior, I imagine, the way that you think, I imagine, and perhaps also the way that you feel or your ability to regulate how you feel with regard to that addiction. And so this idea of biological, developmental, and psychological processes underlying mental functioning means that the mental disturbance may come from somewhere else. It may not start psychologically. It may not be that this thing just showed up in your head and now you're feeling depressed about it. It may be that something has actually happened to you physically. It may be that something has actually developed for you differently, right? But the way that it's going to express itself is going to be in a psychological way. So if you've got some type of developmental difference, let's say something like autism, right? Or something like Down syndrome, well, those are both really developmental and biological processes that are going to have psychological components. They're going to have ways in which a therapist or a psychologist might still be very helpful there. They're going to have concerns that a therapist or a psychologist would be able to treat and would be able to help with, right? Social relationships, regular relationships, how we're going to learn, academics, right? All of these things are still in the purview of a psychologist. I have a certain way that I emote because of my developmental difference, and a psychologist might be able to help with that type of regulation, right? I know that you get really upset when there's a lot of noise in the room, but it's probably best not to scream. Maybe you should ask the teacher if you can leave for a little bit, right? These types of things that are still in the purview of psychology, they're still in the purview of mental health, but they may come from a biological or developmental place. So they're trying to talk about both of those things. This is where it's going to show up, right? It's going to show up in one of these ways if it's a mental disorder. If a psychologist or mental health worker is going to treat it, it's going to show up in one of these three ways, but it may also come from a biological place. It may come from a developmental place as well as a psychological place. So that's what this next piece is that it may come from these places even though it's affecting these places. Mental disorders are usually associated with significant distress or disability in social, occupational, or other important activities. So this is sort of what I started with, right? This idea that mental disorders are really defined by the fact that they're going to cause some harm in the person's life. Here they're saying distress, I like that word too, but harm is what it means, right? Distress just means something bad is happening, I don't like the way it feels, I don't like the outcome, it's not good for me, it hurts, that would be distressing. And so all this is saying here is that there is some harm inherent to a mental disorder as well. Mental disorders are usually associated with significant distress, significant harm, or disability in social, occupational, or other important activities, right? So probably this person's going to have a hard time connecting with folks in the way that we would expect someone of their age, gender, demographics broadly to be able to connect with folks. They may have trouble through school, they may have trouble through getting a job, right, in the way that we would expect someone of their age, blah, 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 demographics to work, right? There's still going to be variation, right? Not everybody gets a job out of college, but if it's not because the market's bad, and it's not because you're just not very talented at the thing that you do, and it's not this, and this, it's because, I don't know, you get upset, or you get really embarrassed, or you just can't show up, or you have a panic attack in the middle of class, and so you can't ever get your teaching done, right? So if it's affecting your work in that way, right, there it is again, that distress, that harm that's coming to you because something's going on psychologically that's a little bit, if not a lot of it, to be fair, out of the ordinary. And it's causing this this type of distress. Distress being the main point. Because an expectable or culturally approved response to a common stress or loss, it should say common stressor, stressor or loss, such as the death of a loved one, is not a mental disorder. An expectable or culturally approved response to a common stressor or loss, such as the death of a loved one, is not a mental disorder. So here we're beginning to make some room for, again, those normal human reactions. What we don't want to have happen is for the DSM, again, where this came from, we don't want the DSM to be used to just say, hey, this person is upset because their dog died. Hey, this person's angry because they didn't get the job they've been working their whole life to try to get. Hey, this person is confused, I don't know, on this test that the teacher put things on that they didn't study for, right? We don't want those sort of normal reactions. We don't want, I got upset because this person died, et cetera, et cetera. We don't want those things to be cast as mental disorders. It is important to psychologists and psychiatrists who wrote this that we still leave some space, hopefully a lot of space, for normal human emotions, for normal variability, for normal responses to our day-to-day life. Again, it would be somewhat stranger, it would be a little more indicative of a mental disorder if a person wasn't having these normal responses, if a person didn't get upset when they lost someone or something significant in their life, if they didn't get a little bit nervous, if they had to do something that was important that they'd never done before, right? And it meant a lot. So we still want to leave that space for culturally approved or expectable responses to stress, right? That we aren't just gonna know everything. We aren't gonna just be perfect, non-emotive people. We are in fact gonna be emotive. It's really about coming back around to this emotion regulation, this ability to function despite, or this ability to move on, that's important, especially when we think about something specific like the death of a loved one, right? When we get to depression, I may spend some time talking about, well, when does grief become depression? Is there some ways to tell? There's a few ways to tell. That's actually a pretty tricky one. But it is something that we're trying to be careful about, right? We don't want everybody who comes in with grief to be diagnosed with depression. So even if it is sort of a thin line between those two things, it is just important that the clinician is aware of that line and is saying, okay, when do I make that determination versus always jumping and saying, well, here's another depressant. Okay, again, here's another caveat, right? Here's another place where this definition tries to back away a little bit and give folks some normal human space, if you will. Socially deviant behavior, that is political, religious, or sexual, and conflicts that are primarily between the individual and society are not mental disorders. So socially deviant behavior really just means here that the person is choosing to do things that are out of the ordinary, right? The person is choosing to do something that we might call a clinically significant disturbance in their behavior, right? This person is behaving in a way that seems disturbed from how they used to behave or how everybody else within their society is behaving. Everyone else in their culture seems to be wearing shoes. And here's this guy who never wears shoes to class. It's winter, this guy never wears shoes anywhere. I'm talking about a specific student I have who's been in this class, a great guy. But he never wears shoes. He never wears shoes anywhere as he goes. And again, if we look at it from just the first top half, okay, well, that's definitely a disturbance in behavior. Everybody else is wearing shoes. I bet he wore shoes at least until he was 12, or at least until, he got out of the house and his parents didn't have a say-so in that. So that's a disturbance, right? That's something different from himself and from the society. You might say that it's associated with some distress, right? Shoes help protect your feet from the concrete that we walk around on, and any type of broken glass or sharp rocks that we might step over and cut into our feet, et cetera, et cetera. And so, yeah, I would check that box too, right? It's definitely causing some harm, not distress in the necessarily mental way, but that's not all we have to mean here. It's causing some distress to his body. Okay, so it checks that. Maybe he can't get a job because you have to wear shoes, and maybe he won't wear shoes for his job either. I don't think that's true, but let's say it was. And then this is not culturally approved. That's not something, so he doesn't get off the hook there, right? And so if we went through this list and just looked at somebody who doesn't wear shoes because they've chosen to, and we hadn't gotten to the socially deviant line yet, we might well say, okay, well, this person's got something going on. I don't know if there's a diagnosis for a no shoe wearing disorder, but something's going on because he's met all of these other criteria. Oh wait, there's another sentence. Socially deviant behavior in conflicts that are primarily between the individual and society are not mental disorders. Well, does that fit for what he's doing? Is he just being socially deviant? Well, we'd have to ask him, to be honest. We'd have to see. Because if I said, hey, dude, why don't you ever wear shoes? And he said, hey man, don't you know shoes eat your feet? Well, that's some type of hallucination, right? That's some type of delusion, perhaps. And so that's something else, unless the dysfunction results from a conflict or deviance as described above. Well, I think that's probably not just a deviance in behavior, a disturbance in behavior, but if I asked him that question and he went on and on about how shoes are evil and they're trying to take your feet over, blah, 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 well, that's also a disturbance in cognition, right? And so now I have this other way of linking the disturbance back to another disturbance to say that, oh, okay, this behavior is disturbed because it's connected to a faulty thought process. It's connected to a false belief about the world that everyone else can agree isn't happening. On the other hand, if I said, hey man, why aren't you wearing shoes? And he says, listen, I just think they are bad for your feet. I just like the way the feet, connect to the ground, and I want to get some nice calluses on my feet so I can walk over anything, or I'm training for a barefoot cross-country race, or, right, if there's some logic to it, even if it's just I want to do it, right, even if it's just something I'm choosing, or certainly if it's, well, people in my religion just don't wear shoes, okay? If there's some logic to it, right, then again, this socially deviant behavior clause, this socially deviant behavior sentence kind of makes an exception for that. It is okay for us just to choose to be different. Again, this definition is trying to give us some space so we don't just take people who are unique and say, well, this is the definition of a mental disorder. Well, in this case, we have some reason to believe, hey, he's just choosing to do that. He's just choosing to be different, or he's got some idea about why this is maybe healthier or better, and it doesn't seem to be out of nowhere. It doesn't seem to be some hallucination, doesn't seem to be some delusion. It's just something that he's found to be true and something he's comfortable with. And yeah, this is just a social deviant behavior, and it's not a mental disorder. You might think about this again in terms of folks who join certain religious practices, or even honestly religious, depends on the cult, I would say, but it could be, you can imagine a cult, right, where people are just coming together believing a certain thing, and that's not necessarily indicative of mental disorder. The same with sexual groups, or the same thing with different political groups, right? That it may be strange to us, but they found some community in it. They made these choices on purpose. They're not being misled or deluded or hallucinating. They've just decided, hey, what if we tried it this way? Okay, not mental disorder. Okay, that's usually when I ask you if you have any questions, but I think I will stop there just for now. I really just wanted to get something out, and this is the type of thing that we would have discussed in our first class, really just kind of what's the class about, what books do I need, yes, the syllabus is up, and really, again, just beginning to think about what it is when we say mental disorder. The last thing I will say about this, I guess, is I'd like for you to think about, because this is probably where I'll pick up next time, is what types of things do you think, before we had a definition of a mental disorder, before we even maybe understood that psychology was something that could be studied, what do you think it is? Maybe leave a note in the comments there. I'd like to see some discussion on this. What do you think it is, or how do you think that other folks perceived mental disorders before we understood what mental disorders were, right? Psychology is still a pretty new science. 1900s, if we're being relatively generous, early 1900s, late 1800s, when psychology is really coming around. Well, what do you think we did with those people, or thought about those people, or how did we conceptualize or understand what was going on for a person 100, 200, 500, 2,000 years ago? I really want you to just kind of think through. You don't have to give me all of those, but think at a certain period in time. What are some ways that we might have thought of somebody with PTSD, or somebody with panic attacks, or somebody with schizophrenia or depression? What are the ways in which we might have thought about them? And maybe even give me some examples, right? Because there's probably going to be some writing on those things, maybe not those things specifically, but hey, in this story, we have an XYZ, because that's just how they thought about folks with schizophrenia at the time, okay? So next week, what we'll do is we'll pick it up, and I am planning on doing about one of these a week. I'm gonna have to be a little faster paced than I usually would be in class, but that's okay. So what I want to pick up with next week is just thinking about how we can begin to define mental disorders. We're not going to look at anything specific yet, but there are some various ways, both just conceptually, but also in terms of their biology and physiology, that we can begin to define certain mental disorders. So we won't talk about specific mental disorders or a specific mental disorder, but we will be thinking about how we can put these different mental disorders into categories, both to just learn about them, but also to maybe get a sense of what they're doing and how we as psychologists in training can begin to understand what it is they're affecting and how they show up for individuals. Okay, that's it. Like I said, look for a video next week. Until then, I'll see you then.